I'm Curious Vedant, and welcome to season 6 of my podcast. Today, my guest is Balvinder Sidhu, or Bal, who is an award winning TV presenter and event host from the UK. She has worked at many English TV broadcasters, including ITV and GB News. Hi, Bal, welcome to my show.
Hi, Vedant. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming here. I'm really excited to interview you and have you on the show.
Good. I'm glad. It's really impressive that you're doing this podcast because this is something that a lot of journalists like myself, we aspire to do and create. So it's really impressive that you are doing this at such a young age.
Thank you. So, Bal, you were the breakfast news presenter for Good Morning Britain for so many years. I'm curious to know what your daily schedule was like then. Your day must have started really early.
So people often mistake sort of working in television as extremely glamorous and you're on TV and it's so cool. But I do want people to know it's actually really hard work. So my day would start with a 3:30 a.m. alarm call. And I would leave my house at 4:30 a.m., which is technically still the middle of the night. Most people are still asleep at that time. I would arrive into the studio just before 5 a.m. And that would give me just enough time to read the scripts for the morning before I went on air and get ready, hair and makeup. And it's hard work. It's an early starts, early morning breakfast news, and to be energetic on live television isn't easy. So I would be on air on the hour every hour during a breakfast program, which is one of the biggest breakfast programs in British television called Good Morning Britain. And I would be reading the regional news bulletins during that program.
Oh, that sounds like really, really, really hard work. I've always seen those programs like BBC or all those different kinds of news programs, and I've always thought, wow, it must be so cool being on that. And like, it must be really, really, really like not easy, but it must be really like kind of free life where you're kind of famous.
I mean, it is. It's definitely you build a profile, which is really nice, and people get to know who you are. But the work is hard, so you don't really ever get to enjoy the perks. So, for example, as a TV presenter, you often get invited to the opening of a new restaurant or a new venue, and these things would always happen in the evening, and I would be too tired at that point to enjoy the perks of the job because I still have to wake up at 3:30. So I would miss out on many social occasions, dinners, parties. My friends would meet up. I wouldn't be able to go because it would be past my bedtime. I have to be in bed by 8 o'clock if I'm going to fully function. So it's great. And you can have a lot of influence if you have a presence in terms of telling the stories that matter. But it's hard work. It is a lot of hard work. But I enjoyed it. And it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be working in television.
That sounds really, really fun, but at the same time, also really, really tiring. I mean, I myself feel really tired when I sleep at 9 and wake up at 6:30. But I can't just imagine how it feels like to sleep at 8 and wake up at 3:30. Yeah,
Yeah, hard.
seems really tiring. But I'm sure you enjoyed it, right?
Yeah, I loved it. I mean, I loved my time because it wasn't just TV presenting. I was a reporter as well. So I would, once I'd done the morning news, I would often get a story that I would go out and I would film. I would interview people and I would put that edit and film packages, which would then be aired on our 6 o'clock news program, which was on television in the evenings. So presenting is when you're in the studio and you're live and you're reading from an auto cue, which is a camera in front of you. And reporting is different. Reporting is actually telling a story, making sure you're giving it balance. So you're telling it from both sides, telling it in a way that is interesting. So you're not just giving information in a flat way. You're making it interesting for people to watch. So pictures, because it's television, it's different to radio. We would always be thinking about what can people see? What are people seeing at home? So if the story doesn't have any pictures, the story wouldn't make it to TV. The more interesting the pictures. And if the story was interesting but didn't have pictures, then we would have to create a way using other things like graphics and reconstructions to tell a story. And some stories are quite tricky to tell on television. So it's a very creative process, is my industry and journalism.
What were your favorite times when you've gone out and done reporting in a city or gone to different towns? Which one stood out for you? Which one did you enjoy the most?
Generally, I think what I just love talking to people. So the journalist in me never switches off. So whenever I'm with people, even if I'm not working, I find people fascinating. I love talking to people. I love listening to them. And because that is my natural way of being, I find that people like talking to me. They like sharing their story. And then I like telling their story. If they have an interesting story to tell, I really enjoy telling it. So it doesn't really matter about the place that I'm going to. I just like people, and they can be anyone. It doesn't matter who they are. I don't necessarily need to talk to people who are famous or really well known. I find stories in the most unusual places. People who nobody talks about, but they've got a really good story to tell. They're really interesting, or something they've done. And then I think, oh, your story, that needs to be told. And that's what I love about my job, because there's lots of people out there with good stories to tell.
I'm pretty sure there are. And I'm pretty sure you've also told loads of stories about people who come from all sorts of places with all sorts of backgrounds, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. For me, people are people and stories are stories. And it's just a really great way of connecting human beings, is storytelling. So in society, if you look at the world in general, there's a lot of differences, and people don't always understand each other's culture, or they don't understand each other's backgrounds, or they disagree. People disagree. That's just human nature. So my job always as a journalist is to tell people all sides of the story, especially when the subject is tricky. And there are a lot of tricky subject matters out there at the moment that are big discussion points in politics and in media. And what I do as a journalist is I show people everyone's side of the story. So you have to listen to this person. Now you have to listen to that person, so you have a better understanding of the world that we live in. And I think that storytelling can really help people come together.
And as a journalist, did you find it hard giving two-sided arguments? Like if you felt strongly about one thing, but you also had to give the other person's point of view, did you find it hard?
So no, not really, because I strongly believe, I mean, one thing is, as a journalist, you have to keep your own opinions out of the story. So you're not really allowed. That can be difficult, but I always went from the perspective that in order for me to, do this story justice, I have to sit with people sometimes who actually make me feel uncomfortable, to understand where they are coming from. So, if we're dealing with stories around, let's say racism, for example, or homophobia. If people are homophobic or racist, sometimes I think I need to sit with them to understand, well, why do you think like that? Why do you feel like that? Where does that come from? Not because I think what they think or say is right. It's just, as people, we are products of our experience, rather than just labeling someone. Where does that come from? I want to understand more, and that can be uncomfortable for me. But I've sort of worked in an environment now where, I just want to hear and understand, and then hopefully through storytelling, show them what the world is like where we live, and help storytelling to give them a different perspective. That might not change their mind, but that might make them think a bit differently.
I think for me, if I was a journalist, I would find it really, 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 really hard to keep my opinions, like push them out of the way, because if there was a story which I felt really strongly about, I would find it almost impossible to not express my really strong opinion in that, because I don't know how it would be. But I really respect you for being able to keep all of that aside. I think it would be really hard.
So my job as a journalist is we're not allowed to give our opinions. That's what impartiality is all about. Journalists, one of the strongest qualities a journalist has is we don't become the story. We are not the story. So all those strong opinions or views, other people will be doing for that story. So I will be finding people who feel strongly and getting them to talk about why they feel strongly. So yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's hard, but a fundamental quality of being a good journalist is removing yourself from the story and not being the story.
Yeah. I respect all journalists for doing that, because it must be really, really hard.
It can be. I think, you'll find that not all journalists do that though. You'll see in life and in the world in general.
Mhm. What do you usually present about on TV?
So I worked in a news organization. So my job was to present the news that was happening in an area called the Midlands in the UK. So it's the size of Singapore, actually, the whole area. So we had about maybe 600, 700,000 people watching that section of the program. The bigger program, it was going across the country. So it would be anything from there's a major fire, a building, police are looking for a criminal. There's Diwali coming up and people are getting together to celebrate. Anything that's happening in that area, that would be what I would be presenting. It would just be the news for that area.
I read that in the bio you worked in ITV Midlands, right?
Yes, yes.
Did you ever change stations, or did you stay
Yes.
at the same Midlands?
So no, then I went to London and I worked for a new channel called GB News. It's been around for a couple of years, and there I was their correspondent. I worked for them in the Midlands, but I was on national news at that point, covering across the country rather than just in one area. And then I presented and anchored a bit there as well. But it was longer programs, like 3-hour shows rather than the morning news. So it was longer programs, a bit more demanding in terms of different guests staying across lots of different types of stories, from COVID to knife crime, big topic we would be discussing on those programs.
Was the nationwide news, did you feel that it was more stressful to present that than Midlands?
Not really. I think once you're a journalist and you have experience of telling stories and you have experience of being in a studio and what can go wrong and you have dealt with difficult situations, then when you get to that, when you do that, it's always come very naturally to me being on television, in a studio, in a live situation. I've never really found it difficult. I did find it nerve-wracking. I was very nervous when I first started presenting and reporting, but when you've been doing it for as long as I have, you become comfortable. You have to feel comfortable to work in television. You have to enjoy it. So I've always enjoyed it.
So if you feel that really stress, would it be harder to do your job?
If I felt stressed,
Yeah, would it be
well,
harder
I
job?
mean, for sure, the job is stressful, but the difference between my job and maybe people who work in an industry where you have projects that are ongoing is that I would do my story and the stress would be in the day while I'm doing the story. At the end of the day, once your program has aired and everything is done, the stress goes. So I never took any stress home. But yes, for sure, my job was stressful, mainly because we get given a story, then we have around 3 to 4, maybe 5 hours if we're lucky, to film the story. So drive to a location, film the story, then bring the material back, edit it, write a script, put it all together, get it checked by a senior producer before it gets put onto television. And in some cases, if the story was sensitive, we would have to send it to our lawyers. Our lawyers would look at it, and then, you feel up until somebody gives it the good tick, like this is a good story, you've done it properly, there's no problem with it technically or editorially, then it would go to air. And that is those few hours, those 4 to 5 hours are stressful. But then when you've been doing it for many, many times, you start to find ways to ease that stress, to make it easier with good planning, good execution. And in some cases, like for me, I would work on longer stories and then I would be given more time to make them. But usually a day-to-day reporter, that's how they work. They have to do everything within a few hours. And that can be stressful. So yeah, it was stressful, but never to a point that I wanted to stop working in that field.
And if you were going live on air in the studio itself, there would be no redoing if you were talking about a story and you maybe skip a sentence or say something wrong. There was no retrying, right? That was it.
You can't do that. I mean, you can't skip a story, you can't skip a sentence. So what we normally do is we do a rehearsal. So we practice, and the cameraman checks that his cameras are working, the producer checks that the pictures are working. And then that rehearsal is usually our, if we're lucky, is our way of making sure everything is okay. You don't always get time to have a rehearsal. So you just got to be prepared. So most of what you're saying is written on the camera in front of you. So you're essentially reading. But if that camera stops working, then you have paper scripts in your hand, so you can refer to them if the camera stops. So you've got to be prepared. And then if pictures stopped working, then you have to be prepared to say, really sorry about that. We're experiencing some technical difficulties. We're going to move on to the next story. You have to have the ability to manage things live on air when they go wrong. And you usually have somebody in your ear, you have an earpiece, and you have somebody in your ear constantly talking to you. So you're live on air, reading the news, but you've got somebody also talking to you. So you've got to be able to switch them off and do your job. Somebody telling you you've got 10 seconds left, because when you're live on air, you've only got so much time. You can only talk for 2 minutes or 3 minutes. So you've got somebody saying, okay, Bal, 10 seconds to shut up, 10, 9, 8, and you've got to finish what you're saying in 10 seconds. Television is all about time. We only have so much time to tell a story. If we go over or under that, we've got a problem.
What would happen if you went over or under a story? If you went over, would they have to cut you off, or
they'd cut us off? Yeah, they'd cut, or you would have to say, that's it, we've got to go now, bye. And you have 2 seconds. Just like if somebody says, look, you've got 3 seconds, you've just got to stop. You can't, think, oh, well, I'm just going to carry on. I mean, there are presenters and journalists out there who ignore producers and directors and continue talking. That's not the norm, because usually people, respect the time etiquette. But if there's a fiery discussion going on national television, or you've suddenly got a really big major event happening, then you can find yourself cutting time or going over time. And that's just part and parcel of our industry. We just have to accept that.
And if you went under, would they have to find something to fill in for that time, or would they put the next slot early?
So no, you find a story, you recap on whatever the big story is of the day. You talk about what's to come in the program later on. So in those situations when you go under, you've got to have something. So sometimes there's some spare stories that the producers can add into the running order live. But if that isn't there, then you as the presenter, you have to talk about something until that zero click happens. And I've had those situations. I've had situations where we're running out of time. I've had situations where I've had 30, 40 seconds to fill, and I've got to talk for 40 seconds, about something. Usually, not just anything. You have to talk about news related things, your program, what's the plan, what's the big story of the day. That is one quality that every TV presenter must have, or must grow to develop.
Yeah, must be really hard, because sometimes, what if you run out of stories? What if you've already done all the news and there's really nothing to recap on or nothing to add on? Then what happens?
So we would just talk about, you just have to know that coming up on the program tonight. So I work on breakfast, right? So between breakfast and 6 p.m., the world changes. There's a big fire, and so, by the end of the day, somebody might have died in that fire. So things develop. So what you would do is you just say, coming up on the program tonight, we will have the latest development on the big fire. And my colleagues, whoever the presenters are of the evening news, my colleagues will bring you that news. That's at 6 o'clock. You just find things to say, and before you know it, it's fine. Never had a problem where it's been really hard to do that, to find something to say that's safe and not controversial, or you're not going to cause yourself any problem because you're just saying anything. You have to make sure it's relevant to your news program.
What did it mean for you to be live on TV in front of millions of people every day?
So I wouldn't say we were millions, it was more hundreds of thousands of people in the Midlands anyway. What did it mean? It was fun. It was nice. I mean, people, they recognize you become, they look forward to seeing you. The thing with being on television and being on television every single day on the same program and coming into, so imagine, when you're getting ready for school in the morning, you see that same face saying, "Good morning, I'm Balvinder, and here are your headlines in the Midlands or in Singapore." You are seeing me every single day. And eventually what happens is that people who watch you, they feel like you are part of their family or their morning routine. So they look forward to seeing you. So outside of my studio, I would sometimes see people who would come up to me and they would talk to me like I am someone they've known for years. And when I left and I came to Singapore, I've had messages from people who used to watch me saying, "We really miss you. You're no longer on our TV. It's not the same." And you receive really sweet messages where you realize that, even though you're on your own in a studio reading the news or presenting, there are people around you who get used to seeing you every day, and then suddenly you're not part of their morning routine, and then they miss seeing you. So that is nice. And I still receive very, very nice messages even now.
I can only imagine how it must feel like hearing or seeing that familiar face or voice every day, and suddenly it's just not there anymore. Yeah, it feels really sad.
Yeah.
What were the other roles you played in the other companies that you worked at?
So I've generally been a presenter and a reporter. But when I first started in journalism, I was a producer. So producers are behind the scenes. So we do the writing, we write the scripts, we edit pictures, we find stories, we look around in the newspapers, or we talk to people and find out what the big story is of the day. We set up guests. So that's what you do as a producer. So that's like an early role. It's a good way to get into a television environment. And then as I did that job, I got invited to audition to be on TV, to be one of their presenters. And then they liked what they saw, and I continued with that. So the kind of main job I've done is reporting and presenting. And then, when you do that, then you start, when you've done it for a long time, you then become somebody who can train young people and help them. So I was doing a lot of that mentoring before I moved to Singapore. So helping, somebody like you're quite young yet. You're not if we have like 16 to 18-year-olds coming in who are, or university students would come in, and I'd work with them. I would tell them what I know. And then we did a lot of stuff around the website, like Instagram, TikTok. That's becoming huge now. So we're also always learning. So the digital era, podcasting and social media were new things when I joined television. There was no Twitter when I first joined television. That came on much later. So we had to learn. I had to learn how to use Twitter, which is called X now. I had to learn how to use Instagram. I had to learn how to use Snapchat, and not Snapchat so much, but TikTok, to become up to date, because people don't watch television in the same way that they used to when my parents were around and or when I was your age. So people now get their news from their phones, or they get them from the internet, or they look at TikTok, or they look at Instagram or YouTube. So things have changed. People don't really watch unless you're an older person. I don't think people your age sit down and think, oh, it's 6 o'clock, the news is on, we must put the TV on. That's what my parents used to do. So things are changing. So the digital era, phones and smartphones and things, means that the way we consume news, the way we watch news is different. So the way we produce news has to change.
From the time you joined, from the time you left the UK, what were some of the major changes that happened in your journey as a media presenter?
Major changes. I mean, I left my job, my old job, and now I'm in another country, which is an Asian country. So I've gone from working in British media to finding myself working on an international level. So now I'm hoping that while I'm in Singapore, I can all the skills that I built in the UK can be transferred across here, and I get to cover news in Asia because Asia is really far away from the UK. So I never did international news, but I'm looking forward to working within Asia and covering some of the Asian news stories, like whether it's in Singapore or whether it's in Thailand or Indonesia or India or China. It's a really exciting move, which is work in progress.
There's a news channel in Singapore called CNA, and they go to all sorts of places. They go to India, they go to Japan, they go to Thailand, they go to China.
Yeah.
So maybe you could try out for them.
Yeah, let's see.
Hopefully, you get a role there.
Yeah, definitely.
I've watched their channel sometimes. I think you would fit in it perfectly.
Oh, that's really nice of you to say. I think it would be, I think I would too. And I think that I would love to do those types of stories and, where I get to travel and I get to talk about what's happening and I get to learn and grow. Because, you can have 15 years of experience, but it doesn't mean that you ever stop learning. I'm learning all the time. So I learn new things all the time. I've kept my skills up to date. I know how to use a big camera, but I also know how to use my mobile phone to film because mobile phones are amazing. Technology is amazing now. There's so much you can do with technology, especially in my field. So yeah, it's exciting. It's very exciting.
You have also worked in radio companies. Different is the experience of doing news in radio compared to on live TV.
So radio, I did a little bit of radio right at the beginning of my career back in 2007. And the key difference is radio is all about sound. So when you're telling a story on TV, you're thinking, what's the best picture? But when you're doing a story in radio, you're thinking, well, what can people hear? So you have to create a lot of atmosphere. So for example, if I'm talking about, I don't know, for example, this is just an example, lots of restaurants are closing post-COVID because owners can't afford to keep their restaurants open because people haven't got the money to go out and spend on meals in restaurants. So how would I create that story? I'm interviewing someone in a restaurant. You can't see the restaurant. So what do? I record the sound in the restaurant. So you will hear people eating, you will hear knives and forks, you'll hear waiters and waitresses saying, "Can I take your order, sir? What would you like with that?" That noise will form the underbelly of the story. So you can hear people talking, the owner saying, "Oh, it's really difficult. I've lost $2 million since I opened this restaurant since COVID." Then you can hear diners in the back. So then as somebody who's listening, you can hear, you can see and feel where you might be. So it's just a different way of telling a story, but it's all to do with sound. Sound is really important. So if I'm doing a story about aeroplanes, then what sound do I need to capture?
Maybe I don't airport sound or the sound of maybe you're in an airplane or on the airfield.
Yeah, or the sound of a plane taking off and landing. Exactly, the sound of the airport. So if I'm talking, it's that natural sound, thinking, okay, I'm talking about airplanes, like how do I help people know where I am? I'm at an airport. Yes, so the sound of an airport, the sound of people checking in and things like that. Sound is incredible. We don't, if because we can see and hear, we often fail to appreciate sound because we can see things, right? But if you then close your eyes and all you can do is hear, then you can really hear like what's going, you can hear, you can just, it's a big sense. Hearing is a big sense. You can really feel the atmosphere of a place. But often people don't really appreciate the sound because they can see. So that's what radio is about. Radio is about creating really good sound for storytelling. Podcasting is similar. So podcasting, this is audio, right? So when you're producing an audio section and you really want people to listen, then you've got to make sure that the people, for example, you're talking to, one, they're interesting, but also that you're getting the right tone in order to keep people's interest when they're listening.
That's really interesting because just as you were describing, like in the restaurant with the people eating in the back, in my head, I could already imagine how the restaurant might look, how it might feel on the inside. So, sound is really important.
Yeah.
You have won many awards. Which are the most notable ones? And what was the work that earned you these awards?
So, winning awards is a major honor and a privilege, actually. I mean, I've been in this industry for 15 years, and in 2018 I picked up a few awards, like quite national awards. One of them was Asian Woman of Achievement in Media, which was presented to me at the Hilton Hotel. Attending that award ceremony was members of the royal family, so it was a very prestigious event. It's probably the most prestigious award I've ever been the recipient of. And it's just stories that matter, stories that I care about. I also won a national. I received an award from Freddie Flintoff. Do you know who that is?
No.
So he's a very famous cricketer in the UK, where he's played for England, and he presented me an award for work that I did on mental health. So I did this piece on men's mental health. I talked about how we see a lot in the news about women's mental health, children's mental health, but how often do we talk about men's mental health? And it stimulated and started a conversation that was needed in that time, and that was in 2016. I never ever expect to win awards. I just do the things or tell the stories that I think are important. Everything else is like it's amazing. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. All these experiences have been wonderful. And I was also a mother when I won those awards. I had little kids. I had Rajan, who you know, my son, and my daughter. My daughter was only 2 at the time, so I had 2 small children under the age of 5, and I was balancing like being a parent and having children, and working and winning awards all at the same time. So for me, it was an incredibly magical moment to be a recipient of all these like major awards.
Yeah, well, congratulations to you.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, it must have felt incredible to stand on that stage and receive those awards in front of so many people who, some of them are just normal people, but some of them who have really, really, really high rankings in society.
So yeah, it is, and the crazy part, Vedant, is that you don't expect to win. So I need to just stress that, because every single time I've won an award, I have never expected to be the name they announce. And then you find yourself on stage, and then you realize you've got to do a speech because you don't think you're going to win. You haven't written a speech. So you're then on stage, and then you have to speak and say thank you and say something interesting, because like you said, there are very high profile people in the audience. They're looking at you now thinking you're an award-winning journalist. You've got to say something interesting or funny. So so each time I have won an award, it's always come as a shock. And And when I get on that stage, I've just had to wing it. So that's another skill I have, just winging it, saying something. And I guess partly it's not been too difficult for me to say something about these stories that I've done, because the stories that I do, I care about so much. So winning an award for them, I always have something to say. But yeah, it's an experience, it's never expected, but you go with the flow.
So nowadays, if you get invited to an award ceremony, do you go with a speech prepared?
No, I never do. I never do, because I sometimes think by writing a speech, I feel silly, because if I've written a speech and then I don't win, I'm just going to be reading a speech, as the person who didn't win. So I never write a speech. I usually, I just never expect it. And I think it's better to go to these things with a humble mind and heart, rather than because there's so many good journalists and there's so many good stories out there. So the competition is always very stiff. But I do give myself a moment sometimes to think, what would I say if I won? And that moment usually happens maybe an hour before, or before the ceremony. I'll just think, oh, what if I do win, then what am I going to say? And then I'll just think, this is something I would like to say. So I do think a little bit, but I don't write anything down.
What made you choose to become a journalist? What did you want to be as a child?
So I made a documentary actually when I was 15 about people who had moved over from India and were living in the UK, like immigrants, newly arrived families. So I did some stories about what that was like for them. Was it easy to fit into British society and things like that? And I knew then, so with me, Vedant, if I ever saw a camera and somebody filming or doing anything to do with a big video camera, I would always stop and ask them what they're doing and what they're filming. That was just me. When I was a kid, if I saw a camera and I saw people on the street interviewing people with a microphone, I would, oh, what are you doing? Like, what is this? Why? I was always intrigued. And then I knew that and I loved watching documentaries. I loved watching television. I just knew that I had a passion there, like I had an interest there. And at 15, I made my first documentary, and I got the highest mark you could achieve for that documentary in school, like the highest mark. So it was very, very good. So I knew then that this is an industry, if I get the chance, I'd like to work in.
And here you are, an award-winning journalist.
I know, and here I am. Here I am. Hopefully, I can inspire others to follow their dreams.
Yeah, I've always admired journalists.
Who's your favorite? Have you got a favorite journalist?
No, I just like seeing the news and seeing documentaries and seeing people talk to other people live, and I'm always like, wow, I wonder how it would feel to go up there and do that.
Well, you're doing it. What you're doing today, for example, with me, is what journalists do, is interviewing someone, having a conversation, then editing that into a piece for people to listen to. That is part of the work that a journalist does. So, and asking questions, writing questions, all of this is already something that is very close to what a journalist does. So you're like a mini journalist, like yeah, you are young journalist. That's the word I'm looking for. A young journalist, aspiring.
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
This is journalists. I mean, journalists now do podcasting as a side thing. Many of them do. They do stuff on the TV, they do stuff on radio, and then they do podcasting. So your experience of interviewing people is definitely very close to the industry that I'm in. So when I launch my podcast, you can be one of my guests.
When do you plan to launch your first episode?
Well, not yet, but it's in the pipeline, and you'll be my guest. But one of the things that we have to do as proper journalists is I have to get permission of your parents, because you're under 16. So there are lots of like rules, especially in the UK, around interviewing children that we have to learn. So we have to your parents have to give me permission to interview you. Then I can do it.
Well, I mean, if they say yes, which I think they will, I'm
Yeah,
always happy to be a guest.
brilliant. Thank you.
What are your hobbies?
I love reading. I'm a member of a book club. When I was your age, Vedant, I spent many hours in a library, just reading books all the time. And then I had kids and I didn't have time to read anymore. So now I have a bit more time. I'm going back into reading. So I love reading. I love reading. I love walking, and I like music. Yeah, I would say those are my hobbies, but I'm always open to new hobbies because I think there's always things you can learn. Cooking, I love cooking. I love eating, especially food. I like good food.
Yeah, those are really nice hobbies. I love all of them. Thank you so much for coming on my show. I really enjoyed speaking to you. I learned a lot.
Oh, thank you for having me. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed talking to you as well.
Dear listeners, follow my Facebook page Curious Vedant to get updates on my upcoming episodes. To listen at leisure on your phone and get notified about future episodes, subscribe by searching for Curious Vedant wherever you get your podcasts, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and many more. You can also listen to my show on curiousvedant.com. Thank you for listening to Curious Vedant, and don't forget to rate and leave comments.